Hi, my name's Alexa Zupan.
I'm Jackson Holbrook.
And I am Rowan Eager.
And today we will be talking about probability in Dungeons and Dragons. So, you might be wondering, what is Dungeons and Dragons? Is it a game? Is it a show? What might this be? Dungeons and Dragons is specifically a roleplay game where you pretty much play as your character, which can be of many different classes and many different backgrounds, which has to go through a journey. Now, probability plays a huge part in this because everything your person does relies on a dice, specifically a d20 for most things. And this d20 can determine anything from combat to trying to notice things pinned to trees in the forest, or even trying to make friends. And this itself dramatically changes the game and the way that a player is played. All different players have different statistics which can boost this or can decrease it and make it more difficult to do better tasks.
Yep. And there is also the Dungeon Master, which has to worry about the statistics for the NPCs and enemies that the players will come across.
Now let's talk about probability just in general. So probability is divided up into two different parts called theoretical and experimental probability. Experimental, according to Mr. Quinn, and on this slide near the top, is basically just a real-life experiment. Say that I throw this little d20 here once, and I get a 13. I was looking for a 1, so I got 0 as my probability. But then say I roll a few more times, and eventually I get a 1 after I've rolled it 10 times. Then I have 1/10 of a probability. So experimental probability is very precise if you can do it enough times. Say that you do it 100 or 1,000, it really doesn't matter. As long as you get it somewhere near the 70s-ish range, it starts to get pretty precise, and it tells you the different trends about which numbers will roll more and which will roll less, most likely. And it accounts for just blind luck, which is accounting for, in case of throwing a dice, would be air friction, how hard you throw it, where it lands, how much it bounces, etc. And that's how experimental probability accounts for this. And say that if me and Alex were to roll one die, the likelihood that we get the same one is so small, simply because experimental probability is never the same. It is never, ever concrete.
I also got a 13, by the way.
I got an 18 out of 14. But anyways, so experimental probability, use it whenever you're trying to conduct your own experiment, which is in the name, to get more precise data about any dice that you may be rolling. We use d20, but there's multiple you can choose from. And so now let's go into theoretical probability, which is defined by Mr. Quinn as basically just any old prediction, which you would think is probability itself, but probability is divided into these subdivisions for a reason, because it covers a very wide net. And theoretical probability is saying that no matter how many times I roll this dice, no matter how many times I do it, no matter what numbers I want, I've got a 1 in 20 chance of getting any one number. And say that I want to get a 15 and a 16 as any one of my numbers, and I've got a 1 in 10 chance of getting that simply because every time that I roll it, there's 2 out of 20 different opportunities for me to get it. Now, think about it like this. I take a box, and I'm about to throw it in the trash. The likelihood that it lands upright is 1 out of 6 because it's a 6-sided box. But then say I throw it multiple times to figure out which is most likely, then that would be showing experimental probability. And they can both be interchangeable, but if you want more precise, like I said before, experimental is your way to go. Now, if you will all do me a favor, is look at the dice simulation that should appear on your screen and roll that dice a few times and see how many times you get a desired number. It could be from any one of the dice that's there.
Yeah.
Was there? Go ahead, Rowan.
keep in mind that the D20 is the D20 decided die. I would also like to point out that there are also many different ways that the probability can be calculated, but you may continue now, Jackson.
Oh, I was pretty much done from there. All I really had to say was that they can be interchangeable, and that if you want to be more precise with it, you go experimental. But if you need something quick and easy, say that you're in the middle of a card game, then you're going to want to do theoretical, simply so that you can calculate which cards you're going to need and what likelihood you're going to get them, and just plan your route accordingly when you're doing that.
Yeah, specifically with theoretical and experimental probability, they aren't solely just for Dungeons and Dragons. They can be used in any type of game or context for probability of pretty much anything. As Jackson was saying, a card game, for example, I know a lot of people love to try to either card count or in Uno try to predict the probability of you winning. That's one way you could do it.
Yeah. Alex, is there anything else you would like to add to this topic?
Well, it itself, the experimental and theoretical probability can bring itself into many different things. For example, saving throws. Now, saving throws, what are they? Saving throws are pretty much the throws your character will need if you run out of hit points during combat. And these throws basically can mean life or death, which I know is a really big topic if you're just like, oh gosh, my character, oh no. But they're actually sort of simple to predict. I mean, your chances of living compared to dying are obviously not great, but as you can see from the chart on the board, mattering on what number you roll, you are going to have a certain chance on either living or dying. Now, the chart shown only shows if you have not rolled previously and there's no advantage or disadvantage. Both previous rolls and advantage and disadvantage can play their way into this. But specifically with saving throws, you want to throw higher numbers, because anything like, as you get higher up, you have more and more chances of living. And living is obviously going to be extremely helpful for your character, mattering on what you want to do. These will either succeed or fail based on this high number roll or low number roll. And if you roll, let's say you roll and you live and then you get put in another life or death scenario. That second life or death scenario will have a higher chance of you dying because of the type of roll you are going to be doing. And the disadvantage to that, it adds a disadvantage when you have to roll multiple different times, which this actually brings its way into Rowan's topic of advantage versus disadvantage.
Yes, many things can affect those rolls, and that can range from advantage, as mentioned by Alex, and a disadvantage. To quickly explain, even though this may have been mentioned, or you may already know this, advantage is when you roll 2 dice and take the highest roll. Disadvantage is when you roll 2 dice and take the lowest. All in all, though, there are many, many different parts to this. There's different types of rolls, which I just explained. But the baseline chances with the D20, which is what we have been using this whole time, the chance of rolling a specific number usually decreases as the number gets higher. For example, if you want to roll, the chance to roll a 1 would be, for example, on a chart, a 1, whereas the chance to roll a 3 would be a 0.9. But per time, so yeah. So rolling a 1 would have a chance of 1, but rolling a 20 would have a chance of 0.05, and disadvantage would change this further. It would cause a major decrease in your chances overall. The chance of rolling a 1 would go from would stay the same, of course, but rolling a 20 would go from 0.05 to 0.002. this was mentioned by Carpenter in 2014. Is there anything you guys would like to add to this currently?
Absolutely. Something specifically that I would like to point out with advantage and disadvantage is this completely matters on your character's stats. Because as you're building a character based off of the racial bonus or your level, you will have either an advantage or disadvantage with each skill. Like, let's say you were doing a skill check walking through the woods, and you would have to do a skill check on, Rowan, what would that be a skill check of?
So what are you trying to see, exactly?
Like, if
Are,
I was walking through the woods and trying to see if there was any danger around me.
that would likely be a perception check.
Okay, so
So,
if you were
for,
doing a perception check, this would be impacted by the skill that it goes along with, and if you have a plus or a minus, this would directly impact the disadvantage or advantage of the character. Like, I'm not sure what advantage or disadvantage my character has in specific, but if I roll a d20 right now, I got a 13. So, based on that, mattering on my disadvantage or advantage, I would have a more likely or less likely chance of seeing something in the woods.
oh yeah, yep. And once again, you were saying something, Jackson?
No, I wasn't. Keep going.
Okay. Yes, disadvantage and advantage will affect your outcome greatly. So yeah, there are also two different ways these rolls might work. Within probability, besides the different types of it, there are also dependent and independent events. Independent events is where you have two or more scenarios, and the first scenario does not affect the second. Dependent events is essentially the opposite, where the first event will affect the outcome of the second. Rolling with advantage or disadvantage are examples of dependent events, whereas rolling normally is an example of independent. So yes, but of course you also have to worry about within D&D, you have to worry about status conditions, and that can change how you roll or not. These status conditions can give you advantage or disadvantage, and this was all mentioned by Emblem in 2018. So yes. Anything else you guys would like to add before I continue?
Nothing really besides how you would get into a situation where it would require an advantage or disadvantage roll. And now these situations can vary from, say, that you have a proficiency in, say, kitchen utensils, then you would, whenever you're doing a cooking check, then you have an advantage roll. Or say that you have been hit with a exhaustion effect, then you are likely to have disadvantage on every roll. And so you can get in these situations a lot of different ways than what we just said, but that's the basic way to get into those situations.
Right, as well as different status effects as well, like let's say poison or things like that would cause you to have to roll a disadvantage. Or let's say, like when you were talking about proficiencies, if you have a proficiency in basically anything, that would cause the advantage for you to have an advantage, but you always don't know like which it's really going to be, because that your dungeon master is a lot of what it's dependent, because you're not always going to have the same checks for the same things.
Yes. Yep. And the dungeon master is essentially just the controller of the world that the players are in. But now we need to focus. Well, now I'm going to go into how you might calculate a roll. Let us use rolling to hit an entity as an example. The equation to hit a specific creature is C equals 21 minus the target's AC minus the player's attack bonus divided by 20, and then again multiplied by 100. Armor class, or AC in D&D, is how hard it is to hit an entity in general. But in this specific scenario, you always have a 5% chance to succeed on an attack and successfully hit the entity. Conversely, you will also have a 95% chance to roll a 1 and fail that attack. This was mentioned by Eldadres in 2019. On this, of course, this equation will change with advantage and disadvantage, but either way, the chance to succeed on a specific action can be easily determined. For example, if a player was attacking a monster or entity with an AC of 12, and the player's attack bonus was +2, then the outcome would come out as a 55% chance to hit the target using this equation. This chance, of course, changes often depending on the conditions that the player is encountering and what the dungeon master has, the dungeon's master's decisions, but it will generally stay pretty similar.
And these conditions can range anything from status conditions to as well as like environmental conditions can sometimes also impact the advantage or disadvantage. Like let's say you were fighting in a swamp, you might get a disadvantage from getting stuck in mud.
Yep. Like another example might be if a monster was very had a high dexterity, which is how easily you move around, they might be harder to hit than normal. Or if they were ethereal, or you could they would only be able to be hit by certain weapons or things like that. But we should probably start wrapping up and go over this all again. So, Alex, or Jackson, if you would like to summarize, I will let you.
So what we've mostly gone over is probability, how it would work in the real world, what defines probability and what can probability be, and how that applies to D&D in terms of death saving throws, to advantages and disadvantages. And so,
yeah. And how it would impact your character.
Yes, we have also briefly mentioned status conditions and how they might change it, and how you might be able to calculate the chance of something yourself. But, anyways, have a good day, and we hope you enjoyed this speech.
Thank you for listening.